By May, the Whitlocks were ghosts in their own home. Food rotted in the pantry. Dust coated the furniture in a film so thick it seemed decades old. No one opened the curtains anymore, though the lamps had long since burned out, leaving the rooms in a dim, grey half-light. Thomas spent his days in the upstairs hallway, sitting in the exact spot where the old mirror once hung, his eyes fixed on the blank wall, as if he could still see something in it. Eleanor's hair began to turn white in streaks, not from age, but from something faster, more violent, as though the colour had been drained overnight. She muttered constantly under her breath, repeating the same phrase. "Don't let them see you." Matthew hardly ate, his skin stretched thin, and yet his eyes glistened in the dark with a faint glassy sheen. The townsfolk had started crossing the road rather than past the Whitlock property. There were stories now that Clara had been found and buried in secret, that Thomas had gone insane, that something was moving in the house at night and could be seen pacing behind the covered windows. One boy claimed he saw two shadows when only Matthew stood at the window. Then, on the night of May the 19th, a scream split the quiet, high, shrill, and cut short too soon. It came from inside the Whitlock house. The next morning, the front door stood wide open. Inside, there were no signs of struggle, no blood, no broken furniture. But no Whitlocks either. Every blanket, every chair, every plate of food was exactly as it had been the day before. The house was silent. Except in the upstairs hallway, nailed into the wall where the mirror once hung, was a single shard of glass. Small, no bigger than a hand, its surface was warped, blackened at the edges. But if you looked closely, and the sheriff swore he did, you could see 4 faces in it. None of them were looking out. All of them were looking in. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? To this day, the Whitlock farmhouse still stands, though no one lives there. The windows remain covered, the cellar locked, and in the hallway upstairs, the shard is still there, nailed in place. Visitors say if you stare into it long enough, your reflection starts to soften, change. And if you don't look away fast enough, you might see someone else staring back. They found Matthew standing at the threshold. The boy was barefoot, his nightshirt soaked to the knees. His skin was cold to the touch, his lips moving without sound. Eleanor rushed to him, wrapping him in a blanket, but he didn't respond. His eyes were open, fixed on something only he could see. Behind him the cellar was dry. No water, no shimmer, just damp stone walls and the smell of earth. But in the days that followed, Matthew was no longer the same. He avoided the rest of the family, spending hours staring into corners or into the dark spaces beneath furniture. Once Clara caught him in the pantry, holding a kitchen knife at arm's length, as if measuring the distance to her throat. When she called his name, he blinked and dropped the knife, looking confused, as though he'd just woken from a dream he couldn't remember. By mid-April, Eleanor begged Thomas to take the children away, anywhere far from the farmhouse. But Thomas refused. "It's in us," he told her, "and there's nowhere far enough." His voice was calm, almost resigned, as if the fight had drained out of him. Then came the night Clara disappeared. It was raining hard and the wind rattled the boards over the windows. Eleanor woke to the front door slamming open, rain blowing in. She ran to the porch, but Clara was already halfway across the yard, barefoot in the mud, walking toward the ruins of the barn. Thomas chased after her, but when he reached the blackened foundation, she was gone. No footprints beyond the barn. No sound except the rain. 3 days later, a neighbor found her dress snagged high in the branches of an oak tree a mile from the Whitlock property. The fabric was shredded, stiff with something darker than rainwater. The sheriff searched the woods for a week, but they found no body. After that, Eleanor refused to sleep. She sat in a chair by the front door, shotgun across her lap. Eyes on the hallway that led to the cellar. But she wasn't watching for something to come out. She was watching for something to come in. Because by then, they both understood. The thing in their blood wasn't trying to escape the house. It was calling the rest of itself home. March of 1948 was the breaking point. The snow began to melt, and with it came a slow seep of groundwater into the Whitlock cellar. At first it was just a nuisance, a few inches of icy water pooling against the stone. But within days, the water was waist-deep, and Thomas noticed something horrifying. Even in the dim light, the surface shimmered. It wasn't a reflection in the ordinary sense. The water didn't mirror the cellar beams above. It showed faces. Not all at once, and never complete. A cheekbone here, an eye there, lips moving in some silent, urgent chant. The images wavered with the ripples, but Thomas swore the water's faces looked older than they should have. Ancestors long dead, some he recognized from fading photographs his mother once kept. Others he didn't recognize at all, and those faces seemed to linger longest, as though they wanted him to know them. That night, the children refused to go downstairs. Matthew had seen the water too. "They're asking me to come in," he said, trembling. Clara slapped him, not out of cruelty but from sheer panic. "Don't answer them," she hissed. "If you answer, they can hear you." Eleanor demanded the water be drained. Thomas tried. He brought in buckets, a pump, anything he could find. But no matter how much he removed, it always returned by morning, clear and cold, like it had never been touched. The faces became more distinct, their mouths now forming words in unison. Eleanor claimed she could understand them. They were speaking the family name, over and over, until it didn't sound like language at all. One night, unable to bear it, Thomas went into the cellar alone. The next morning, he wouldn't say what he'd seen, but he locked the door, nailed it shut, and told his family, "It's not water anymore." The house felt smaller after that, airless, as though the thing below was swelling upward, pressing against the floorboards. The Whitlocks began to sleep less, eat less, barely speaking, except in half-whispered sentences. Neighbors noticed their windows stayed covered even in the daylight. And then, in early April, the cellar door burst open on its own. It began with the children. Matthew, the youngest, was the first to speak of it, though his words were brushed aside as bad dreams. He told his mother he saw faces in the corners when he lay in bed at night, not whole people, just fragments, a mouth whispering without sound, a single eye staring from the dark seam between wall and ceiling. Eleanor told him it was the wind, the play of shadows, but Matthew swore they looked just like us, only wrong. Clara, usually the quiet one, began avoiding her own siblings. She claimed that when she looked at Matthew, she sometimes saw another version of him, standing slightly behind. Not in space, but in time, like a faded photograph bleeding into the present. That version didn't blink, it didn't breathe. It only stared, with the kind of attention that makes you feel like prey. By February, the entire family was sleeping with the lamps burning low. The glow softened the edges of the room, made it harder for the mind to mistake shapes for faces. But the light didn't stop the smell. It came suddenly one evening, a faint metallic tang, like rust and wet earth. Thomas checked the cellar, the attic, even the barn's blackened remains. There was nothing. Yet the smell grew stronger, and with it, a strange heaviness in the air, as though the house itself had grown aware of their movements. One night, Eleanor woke to the sound of someone breathing at the foot of her bed. She reached for Thomas, but he was already awake, staring into the darkness. "It's not in the glass anymore," he whispered. "It doesn't need it." They began covering every reflective surface, even the sheen of water in their cooking pots. Windows were draped in heavy cloth. Any object that caught the lamplight too cleanly was either dulled with soot or taken outside and destroyed. But no matter what they did, the family began to change in ways they couldn't hide from each other. The lines of their faces seemed to shift subtly, as though their bones were learning a new shape. Their voices, at times, carried echoes, overlapping with tones no human throat should make. It was then Thomas realized the truth. The thing they'd tried to keep locked away for 20 years wasn't in the shards at all. The mirror had only shown it. It had always been in them, waiting for the day it could step fully into the world. The object had once belonged to Thomas's mother, a tall, gilt-edged mirror passed down from her own grandmother. It was said to have hung in the Whitlock home since before the Civil War, surviving fires, storms, and moves across states. But in 1927, something happened in front of that mirror that would splinter it into a dozen jagged pieces and drive the family into a lifetime of reflectionless exile. Thomas was 20 at the time, newly married to his wife Eleanor, and living in that same creaking farmhouse. One night, during a summer thunderstorm, Eleanor claimed she heard someone walking in the upstairs hallway. Thinking it was Thomas, she stepped out of their bedroom, only to see his reflection in the hall mirror, standing behind her. But when she turned, the hallway was empty. The reflection smiled at her, wider than Thomas ever could, and its eyes were not his. She screamed, waking the whole house. Thomas came running, but by the time he reached her, the reflection had shifted again, this time showing not Eleanor's face at all, but the face of Thomas's father, pale and grinning, though the man had been dead for 3 years. In the seconds that followed, the glass cracked on its own, a sharp sound like ice splitting on a frozen lake. Thomas smashed the rest of it with the fire poker, each blow echoing like a gunshot in the narrow hallway. He gathered the shards, wrapped them in burlap, and carried them to the barn, locking them in a wooden chest. The family never spoke of that night again, not to friends, not even among themselves, but from that moment forward, no mirror remained in the house. Eleanor, already carrying their first child, insisted the thing in the glass had been real, and that it hadn't just shown her faces from the past, but something waiting in the blood. She told Thomas that his family line had been marked long before he was born. His Riat grandmother, she claimed, had been part of a sect that believed mirrors could reveal a person's true inheritance, not just their reflection. Some inheritances, they said, should never be seen. For years afterward, Thomas kept the chest sealed, convinced that as long as the shards remained hidden, whatever had been in that glass would stay buried. But by the winter of 1948, something had started to seep back into the house, and this time, it didn't need a mirror to find its way in. By January of 1948, the Whitlocks had been living without mirrors for 16 years. Snow lay heavy on the eaves, and the town's main road was little more than a frozen artery of ruts and ice. That winter, an oil shortage meant people were burning anything they could find for heat: old furniture, broken crates, even entire barns that had been left to rot. For the Whitlocks, it was desperation that forced them out of hiding. Thomas's eldest daughter, Clara, was the one sent to barter for fuel. She was 23, though in town they remembered her as a child, shy and pale. When she walked into Barlow's general store, the hush was immediate. She kept her head down, her voice low, asking for kerosene. And then it happened. She turned to leave, and for the briefest moment, her face passed within the wide gaze of the store's mirror. A gasp rippled through the room. Mr. Barlow swore he saw something wrong, something moving beneath her skin, like the shifting of a second face buried just beneath the first. Clara didn't look at the mirror. She didn't even glance at the people staring. She paid, left, and disappeared into the snow. The next morning, Barlow boarded up his mirror. That girl's eyes, he told a friend over whiskey, weren't hers alone. Within a week, rumors clawed through the town like a sickness. Some said the Whitlocks weren't entirely human. Others whispered about an old coal mine collapse years earlier that had buried 30 men, including Thomas's father, and that one man had crawled back out, but not as himself. When the sheriff came to speak with Thomas, he refused him entry. "The house is clean," Thomas said through the door. "We've kept it clean. You wouldn't understand." He wouldn't explain what clean meant. But a week later, in the dead of night, townsfolk saw a small fire on the Whitlock property. By morning, the barn was gone, burned to its stone foundation, and in the ash, someone claimed to have found shards of glass, old, blackened, and warped. What none of them knew was that those shards weren't from a mirror in the barn. They were the last pieces of something Thomas had kept locked away since 1927, something that, once whole, had shown him the truth about his own bloodline. They say every house remembers the faces that once looked into its glass, but this one, it remembered none. For half a century, not a single reflection passed between its walls, no glint of silvered glass, no quiet moments of self-recognition. The family who lived here had stripped the house bare of mirrors, polished metal, even water basins deep enough to catch an image. It wasn't an accident. It was a vow. And like most vows carved deep into bloodlines, it began with something unspeakable. In 1932, on a wind-beaten stretch of land in rural Pennsylvania, the Whitlock family shut their doors to the outside world. Neighbors stopped seeing them in town, except for the father, Thomas, who came once a month for supplies. He never lingered. He never looked anyone in the eye for more than a few seconds, and he never, under any circumstances, went near the general store's large wall-mounted mirror. The story was whispered in small-town bars and back porches. The Whitlocks had been cursed. Some said a child had been born wrong, with a face so strange it made others faint. Some swore they were hiding the shame of an ancestor who'd gone mad and carved his own image away. But if you stood outside their property on a still night, you might see flickers of movement in the upstairs windows, shadows gliding past with heads bowed low as though afraid to meet their own eyes. The youngest son, Matthew, would later say he grew up not knowing what he looked like. His mother combed his hair each morning in front of a blank wall, using her hands as the only guide. "We knew our faces by touch," he said once, before falling silent, as if speaking the memory had violated some unbroken rule. What drove them to erase their own reflections wasn't just superstition, it was fear. But not fear of vanity or of spirits, fear of recognition. They believed there was something in their blood too, that could only survive in the dark, something that, once seen, could not be unseen. And in the winter of 1948, the reason for that fear finally stepped into the daylight.